For decades, there was a famous saying among pilots and passengers, "If it ain't Boeing, I ain't going." Boeing wasn't just a company, it was the gold standard of American engineering and aviation safety. But on 29th October 2018, that reputation began to fall out of the sky. Lion Air Flight 610 plunged into the Java Sea, killing all 189 people on board. Just 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed under the exact same terrifying circumstances, killing 157. 346 people were dead. The brand new aircraft involved in both crashes, the Boeing 737 MAX, was immediately grounded worldwide. The public was told it was a software glitch, but the truth, revealed by congressional investigations and the National Transportation Safety Board, was far worse. This wasn't just a code error, it was the result of a corporate panic. It was a story of a company terrified of losing ground to its biggest rival, Airbus. To save time and money, Boeing bypassed building a new airplane, strapped massive new engines onto a 1960s airframe, and used a hidden piece of software called MCAS to force the plane to fly normally. Worse, to avoid paying for expensive pilot training, Boeing kept that software a secret from the people flying the plane. And if you thought the tragedy of the 737 MAX ended when the planes were finally allowed back in the air, it didn't. In January 2024, an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 suffered a catastrophic mid-air blowout when a door plug ripped off the side of the fuselage at 16,000 feet. The NTSB investigation found a chilling detail. The plane had left Boeing's factory missing four critical securing bolts. It proved that the rot inside Boeing's manufacturing culture hadn't been fixed. How did a company built by brilliant engineers become a company driven by Wall Street profits at the cost of human lives? To understand the complete story of the 737 MAX, the engineering compromises, the cover-ups, and the fallout that Boeing is still paying for today, we have to go back to the year 2010. We have to go back to the moment Boeing panicked. In December 2010, the European aerospace giant Airbus made an announcement that shook Boeing to its core. Airbus introduced the A320neo, which stands for New Engine Option. Instead of spending billions of dollars and a decade designing a brand new jet from scratch, Airbus simply took their incredibly popular A320 and bolted on new, massive, high fuel efficient engines. For airlines, fuel is the number one expense. Airbus was suddenly offering a plane that burned 15% less fuel. Boeing's original plan was to take their time and build an entirely new airplane to replace the aging 737. But in the spring of 2011, American Airlines, a company that had exclusively bought Boeing jets for over a decade, called Boeing's leadership with an ultimatum. American was going to order hundreds of the new Airbus jets unless Boeing could match them. Boeing couldn't wait 10 years for a new plane. They had to act in months. So, they scrapped the new airplane concept and decided to do exactly what Airbus did. They would put those same giant, fuel-efficient engines on their existing 737 airframe. They called it the 737 MAX. But Boeing made a fatal promise to the airlines. They promised that the 737 MAX would fly exactly like the old 737s. They promised that pilots would not need to spend days in expensive flight simulators to learn how to fly it. That single promise, protecting the airline's bottom line by avoiding simulator training, dictated everything that went wrong. There was a massive physical problem with Boeing's plan. The Boeing 737 was designed in the 1960s to sit very low to the ground. This was great back then because it allowed passengers to board using air stairs without a jet bridge. But the new LEAP 1B engines required for the MAX were huge. They physically did not fit under the wings. To solve this, Boeing engineers pushed the engines further forward and mounted them higher up on the wing. But changing the physical shape of the plane changed its aerodynamics. In wind tunnel testing, engineers discovered a dangerous flaw. Because the size and placement of the new engines, the 737 MAX had a tendency to pitch its nose upward during certain steep maneuvers. In aviation, If a plane's nose pitches up too high, it loses lift. It stalls and it falls out of the sky. Boeing couldn't change the physical design anymore, and they couldn't tell the pilots that the plane flew differently because that would require simulator training. So they patched the hardware problem with a software solution. They created MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. MCAS was designed to run in the background. If the system sensed the plane's nose was getting too high, MCAS would automatically roll the stabilizer on the tail and push the nose back down. To save money and simplify the system, Boeing engineers tied MCAS to just one single angle of attack sensor on the side of the airplane, a single point of failure. If that one sensor broke or was hit by a bird, it would feed false data to the computer, telling MCAS the plane was pointing up when it wasn't. And the most damning part, Boeing removed almost all mentions of MCAS from the pilot flight manuals. The FAA agreed to let Boeing remove it. When pilots stepped into the 737 MAX, they had no idea MCAS even existed. On 29th October 2018, the deadly flaw became a reality. Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia. Almost immediately, a faulty angle of attack sensor began feeding bad data to the flight computer. It told the plane its nose was dangerously high. MCAS activated. It aggressively pushed the nose of the plane down. The pilots were completely confused. They had never heard of MCAS. They pulled back on their control columns, fighting the plane, trying to bring the nose back up. But MCAS was designed to activate in cycles. Every few seconds, it pushed the nose down again. It was a tug of war between the pilots and a computer system they didn't know existed. The computer won. The plane dove into the Java Sea at hundreds of miles per hour. 189 people died. In the aftermath, Boeing sent out an emergency bulletin reminding pilots how to disable the trim system, but they still downplayed the severity of MCAS. The FAA, shockingly, allowed the 737 MAX to keep flying while Boeing worked on a software update. It was a fatal miscalculation. On 10th March 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa. A sensor failed. MCAS activated. The pilots, aware of the Lion Air crash, tried to follow Boeing's emergency checklist to cut power to the tail motor. But because they were flying at high speed, the aerodynamic forces on the tail were too strong. They physically could not turn the manual trim wheel to save the plane. Flight 302 crashed into a field, killing all 157 people on board. It was only after this second crash, and after international regulators in China and Europe stepped in, that the FAA finally grounded the 737 MAX. The most infuriating part of the Boeing 737 MAX story is that the aviation industry had seen this exact sequence of events before. On 3rd March 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 crashed into a forest outside Paris after a rear cargo door burst open mid-flight. The sudden depressurization caused the passenger floor to buckle under the enormous pressure differential. Because the critical hydraulic control lines ran beneath this floor, they were severed, rendering the plane completely uncontrollable and paralyzing the pilot's ability to steer. All 346 people on board were killed in what became the first catastrophic wide-bodied commercial aircraft accident in history. Just like the 737 MAX, there was a warning that was ignored. In June 1972, an American Airlines DC-10 suffered a remarkably similar explosive cargo door failure mid-flight, but the pilots miraculously managed to land the crippled aircraft. Investigations revealed that the design of the locking mechanism was flawed. It made it possible for the door to appear closed from the outside even when the latches were not fully engaged and the lock pins were not in place. However, instead of issuing a mandatory airworthiness directive to force McDonnell Douglas to fundamentally redesign the door, the FAA relied on a casual, informal gentleman's agreement allowing the company to handle the problem internally. The resulting modifications were clumsy and inadequate. A cozy relationship between a manufacturer and a regulator led to a catastrophic second crash. The total number of people killed in the 1974 DC-10 crash, 346, is the exact same number of people who died across the 2737 MAX crashes combined. The global grounding of the 737 MAX lasted 20 months. During that time, investigations ripped Boeing open. Congressional hearings and a scathing report from the House Transportation Committee revealed a broken safety culture. They found that Boeing deliberately concealed information from the FAA, airlines, and pilots. Internal emails surfaced showing Boeing employees mocking regulators, with one famous email stating the MAX was designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys. The investigations also highlighted a massive failure by the FAA. Much like the DC-10 era, the FAA had essentially outsourced its own safety certification back to Boeing under a program called ODA, letting the company grade its own homework. To get the plane back in the air, Boeing was forced to completely redesign MCAS. Today, the software must rely on two sensors, not one. If the sensors disagree, MCAS disables itself. It can also only activate once rather than over and over again. And crucially, airlines are now required to put their pilots through simulator training before they can fly the MAX. The disaster cost Boeing over 20 billion US dollars. The CEO, Dennis Muhlenberg, was fired. Boeing even paid a $2.5 billion settlement to the Department of Justice to resolve criminal charges of conspiracy to defraud the United States. By late 2020, the planes were cleared to fly again. Boeing swore they had changed. They promised a renewed dedication to engineering excellence and safety. But 2024 proved them wrong. On 5th January 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 was climbing through 16,000 feet when a deafening explosion tore through the cabin. A panel on the side of the fuselage, known as a door plug, blew completely off the airplane, leaving a gaping hole. The cabin instantly depressurized. Phones, shirts, and headrests were sucked out into the freezing sky. Miraculously, the seats right next to the blowout were empty, and the pilots managed an emergency landing without any fatalities. But the NTSB's preliminary investigation revealed a terrifying truth. This wasn't a complex software flaw like MCS. This was a failure of the most basic manufacturing principles. The report showed that when the plane left Boeing's factory in Renton, Washington, it was missing four critical securing bolts. The bolts that were supposed to hold the door plug to the airframe were simply never installed. This blowout shattered any remaining trust in Boeing. It proved that the core issue, a corporate culture that prioritized production speed and financial output over rigorous quality control, was still deeply embedded in the company. Today, the fallout continues. Following the Alaska Airlines blowout, the FAA took unprecedented action. They capped Boeing's production, severely restricting the number of 737 MAX planes they are legally allowed to build each month until they can prove their factories are safe. In the face of relentless pressure, Boeing's leadership fractured again. CEO Dave Calhoun announced his resignation alongside other top executives in the commercial airplane division. Financially, Boeing has bled billions and surrendered massive amounts of market share to Airbus, the very rival they panicked over back in 2010. Statistically, the 737 MAX flying today is a safe airplane. The software has been fixed, the pilots are trained, and regulators are watching closer than ever. But the story of the 737 MAX will forever be a dark chapter in aviation history. It is a textbook example of how the relentless pursuit of profit, the cutting of corners, and the arrogance of corporate management destroyed one of the greatest engineering legacies the world had ever known.